This is Vital Signs, Redpoint's health tech podcast, and I'm Jacob Efron. On today's episode, we had Chris Hogg, CEO of Marley Medical. Chris was previously the chief commercial officer at the connected inhaler Propeller Health, and at Marley, he's running a virtual primary care clinic focused on folks with chronic conditions. Marley's raised $12.5 million from investors like Andreessen, CRV, and Rock Health. And we had a wide-ranging discussion. We hit on how to choose states when you're first starting with a new startup.
We analyzed all 50 states and we looked at what can doctors do, what can NPs do, what can pharmacists do, rates of disease, and so on. And then the main thing that we ended up focusing on was concentration of payers.
We talked about the strengths and weaknesses of different sales models in digital health.
We're definitely in like an unbundling phase, and then we'll go back bundling. If I had to guess, I think whoever has the best relationship wins in the rebundling.
And we also hit on how AI is going to influence Marley's care model.
The most obvious use case for us is have this thing write a first draft response that then the care team can review, edit, and then send. It saves a bunch of time.
I think folks are really going to enjoy this one. Chris, I feel like there's, with you and your background in healthcare, there's like a million different directions we can go. I'm very excited to have you on.
Oh, thanks so much, Jacob. I'm really excited to be here as well. It's good to see you.
Well, to kick it off, I feel like, you were part of these initial digital health circles here in San Francisco around, 2010-ish. And I feel like you and this group were talking about a lot of different ideas and technologies. And I'm curious, as you reflect back on that, like over a decade later, what do you feel like has come true from some of the stuff you were talking about, hasn't, and how do you kind of make sense of what digital health has been this past decade?
We talked a lot about how there's all this silo data. It's the EMR, but it's very punctuated, and we're going to use devices and patient-reported outcomes and surveys and fill in the gaps and create this big, rich longitudinal picture of a patient and how they're doing. And I think by and large, that's pretty true. Like that's happened. You have RPM and you have a lot more, digital therapeutics even where we're surveying people. And so I think a lot of that actually did come true. I think the biggest surprise obviously was just how hard and how long everything took. Back then, everyone was so optimistic. I mean, I was super naive. I remember telling my wife, I'm like, I'm going to start this company. Everything's going to happen so fast, and if I don't do it now, I'm going to miss it. And just to watch it, just take a decade and a half to kind of come in. Some of the stuff was a little far out there that I thought would be more around like diagnostics. And that really hasn't happened quite as much. There was, back then there was like the the Tricorder X Prize and companies like Scanadu where we're going to have a diagnostic tool in our pocket that was going to diagnose everything, and that hasn't come to fruition, but still in sort of the same like data vein.
It's really interesting. I mean, I do feel like obviously there's been a tremendous uptake in a lot of these, data tools that, even just in EMRs, right, to gather a ton more data. And I think, obviously I think we'll get in later, that's something that Propeller played on, that Marley plays on. And so I think certainly, kind of something that's unified your career together. I mean, I guess I'd love to start with 100 plus, right? I think I think our listeners, I'd love for you to just explain what that was. I think it's, so many people have thought about different kind of like gamified consumer apps in healthcare. Like, I'd love if you could just walk us through, your thought process behind that and what the company was.
Yeah, so that was back in 2011. We started that. So I was coming out of pharma, and honestly, I was like so frustrated and burned out with the whole like healthcare system that this was, the opportunity. We're going to move upstream and we're going to make people healthier and not have to deal with, all of this stuff. And it was also, iPhones were fairly new. Games were coming out. There was a big rush out there to create new vertical consumer experiences. And so there was a couple of us that dove into health and our whole thing was, trying to help people do small, healthy things in their daily life. Because that's what really adds up to long, healthy life. And so we would, based on their location, we created all these things called HOPs or health opportunities, and we would surface those for people depending on where they were, like at the office, or we were big in San Francisco, so we had like every hill and staircase or like geotagged, and you would pop it up and like, hey, why don't you take this hill? And there was some great things in there. But it was a super tough business. Back then that was like the consumer era where if you just build it and get users and do it, then we'll figure out like there's gonna be all sorts of ways to monetize these people, and we'll just do that. And that ended up not being true.
Yeah, I'm super curious. Like, do you think if with the benefit of the wisdom and just also the way that the market's developed over the last decade, like if you were starting that company again today, like, do you feel like there is a business model there, or is it kind of just, hey, it's really hard to build a company like that, to your point, because it's just difficult to figure out the monetization side?
I do think that concept of like keeping people healthier and improving health is going to be a part of many, many different solutions. Like for sure, we're doing that at Marley, where there's a behavior and a health coaching component to it.
Totally.
And so I do think if you think about the model in like, who are you targeting? Are they expensive? Are costs going to go down? There might be a way in there. There was just like a company, Bold, just announced, a Series A company, Amanda Reese, and that's exercise in the home for Medicare seniors, and so yeah, I do think that there's ways to probably monetize it now. There's a couple ideas in there that I love that I think about, like how to bring them into Marley is like part of our offering too.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, it feels like it would be, it feels like a lot of these really great consumer experiences will just be part of a business model that is more maybe traditional, selling into payer or employer or whatever it is. After obviously 100 Plus was acquired by Practice Fusion, and after Practice Fusion, you went to Propeller. I feel like Propeller is this super interesting business, one of like the early pioneers in connected tech, remote monitoring, all these things we talk about today all the time. And I feel like one of the things that comes up again and again with these businesses, and one of the hardest parts of them is, how do you fit into physician workflows, into patients' daily lives? I feel like some of these things can have so many alerts come off them. It's like, they get silenced at some point. Like, I feel like, what were some of the things you learned at Propeller about how to do this? And how does that kind of impact how you think about doing this at Marley today?
Taking them separately on the patient side, I think one, obviously it's about solving a need for them. I mean, you're not going to get anyone, everyone's so busy. They're not going to do something unless it's sort of critical to them. And here we had people that were really at risk and nervous about asthma attacks, COPD exacerbations, and this gave them some insights. So there was something there. And then the main thing after that is like friction. There's friction everywhere, and it's so hard. Even downloading an app is friction. Bluetooth is friction. Having to go somewhere to the doc and schedule is friction. And so we just, on the patient side, it was about like iterating and constantly, there's not one silver bullet. It's just a bunch of tries, and you just keep removing like little bits of friction. Like we got pairing to happen seamlessly without having to go into Bluetooth, things like, because Bluetooth is so janky, and every one of those, like your engagement goes up like a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. And all of a sudden you're like, that's kind of working, people are using it and it's cool. The provider side was even harder though, for sure. I think one of the most frustrating things that I've done, maybe in my career, was try to commercialize something that early, because I think if it like works, it's great all the time. And if it doesn't work ever, it's kind of fine. But we had these like pockets of greatness, where a certain clinic would just totally adopt it, like change their practice. Like I have data now. I'm going to call people in who aren't doing well, and I'm only going to schedule annual visits and fill in the schedule to people who need it. And it was like amazing. And it totally worked. And we published and published and published on how it worked. And then, but it was so spotty, like trying to get a whole clinic to revamp their process, bring in new data. They probably need an FTE just to like monitor it and do outreach. And that's hard. And it changes like how am I going to get paid if I'm not scheduling visits every 4 months? Like what's going to happen? And so that was the harder part, actually. And honestly, one of the big genesis of Marley, of starting a clinic, which is, we know this can work, so let's like build the clinic around it so that we don't actually have to convince people to change everything. The other really hard part with a traditional clinic and bringing it online is, if you want, it's kind of a catch-22. In order for the clinic to fully adopt it, you need most patients to use it. But in a clinic, there is a wide variety of patients. Some do want it, some don't want it, some are tech savvy, some are not. And so it's such a hard lift to like go to the almost lowest common denominator of the experience of what people will be able to handle.
Totally. No, it's super interesting, because I feel like that's a problem we run into a lot in digital health, where, it's like, oh, you use this for just this one payer or this one payer type or this like, subset of patients. And then you're like, if you stitch that all together, you're asking like, 6-7 different workflows depending on who the patient is. And it ends up getting thrown out completely. It's just easier to have something that works across the board. But, in your case, I guess what it was the connected inhaler was mostly, I imagine, for COPD.
It started asthma. So David Van Sickle, who was the co-founder and CEO, was a respiratory epidemiologist and was studying asthma. And literally, it's like the great story. It's like he wanted to know where asthma was happening into the community and started tinkering and making sensors and Velcroing to people's inhalers and sending them out. And it's like, oh, this is pretty valuable. We should do something. And then moved into COPD, because the meds are mostly the same. The sensors work the same. But super different markets, different payers. It became complicated for sure.
And you were obviously tasked with commercializing, as a chief commercial officer, I feel like, and this was before a lot of like the precedents were around for how to set up these arrangements, and and even obviously at that point a lot less folks in risk. Like, what were some of the different payment models you tried, and who ultimately ended up paying for Propeller?
Man, we had a lot. We had a lot of stuff going on. So we tried a lot of different things. Basically, we had like two different camps. One I would say is payer provider. And so there we would go to payers, and it was like a disease management program, typical B2B to C. They would identify patients, give us a list. We would try to enroll them. That I think we can talk later, but that's like one of the fundamental flaws in digital health right now. Like that go-to-market approach is really, really tough. And then on the provider side, it was really trying to get, these clinics to use it. And of course, this is before RPM codes were there, so they're not getting paid for it.
That certainly made go-to-market a lot easier for these businesses.
Yeah, I think it would have been a little bit easier, because, I look back and I sort of laugh and I'm like, what, we're trying to do the right thing. These things definitely work. They reduce hospitalizations. But at the end of the day, I was selling a product that reduced hospitalizations to a hospital. And so these things at some level, like sometimes become challenging. And then on those contracts were typical like PMPM type deals, more like per enrolled patient. We always got paid on enrollment, and it'd be for a year or something. We ended up with Express Scripts doing one where it was like they paid for a certain amount of time, which covered our costs, and then it was monthly based on retention. We pitched another company. We started pitching like risk-based because we were real confident in the data that we had published. And that was like one of the funniest stories ever. It's like, we'll go at risk for whatever, even utilization, like hospitalizations, ED visits or control. They're like, this is great. They come back and like, we don't know how to benchmark this. We don't know how to model. Can you just pitch us a PMPM? And I'm like, you're kidding, right? And then the other side of the business was pharma. And that ended up being like a big part of the business. And there, they were really interested in connected inhalers as like a new kind of product line. And so we helped them co-develop these sensors and experiences, did a lot of custom development for them, and then did some commercialization, a bunch of commercialization projects with them.
And is the idea on the pharma side that it's just kind of a differentiated offering in a competitive space?
Yeah, absolutely. And like most basically, we improved adherence a lot. Yeah, so, there was like a real clear ROI to them because we had, sensors that would go on their daily medication as well as albuterol. And, we were showing 50 or more % increase in adherence because we knew whether they took the med that day or not and could send really targeted reminders.
Super interesting. There's so much in there that you just said that I want to dig into. I'd be remiss not to, you mentioned the B2B to C kind of sales motion is one that may be flawed in digital health. That's too juicy not to follow up on. Well, what do you mean by that?
Oh man, it's so hard. So back then, like everyone forgets that we were early B2B to C. There was a group of companies. But the reason wasn't because it was like the greatest model. It was because we built these things, these services or offerings that didn't fit into any category, right? We were not a drug. We were not a traditional service. We're not a lab. And so the people who pay like didn't know what to do with you. And so you end up going in like direct contracting with the people who pay so that they could pay for your like new product. And so that's the genesis of B2B to C. It's like there was no other avenue open. So it's like, I don't know, I guess we got to go try to pitch these guys and get them to pay us. But the problem with B2B to C is on enrollment. And so most programs, you can get the deal. Back then, it was easier to get the deals for sure because we were innovative and it was new and people were sort of excited. Today, I think it's like crazy town. It's so crowded and complicated and you need so much. But then, the way it works, then you have one payer with that contract. And so I can only enroll people that are under that contract. And so your hands are tied. You have like direct mail, maybe phone numbers if you're super lucky. And there was a couple companies like Livongo that did real well with percentage of, capture off the list, but most didn't. And it was just felt handcuffed, man. It was like, I don't know. It's very hard to try to run a growing startup where you don't control your growth. And so nowadays, I think it's everyone tucked in behind that and everyone's B2B to C because there was success. But I think it's like so hard now because you need data, but you need them to give you the data. You need them to give you the patients so you can generate the data, but you need the data to get the contract. I think there's like this catch-22 loop in B2B to C right now.
It's really interesting. Both your point that like you're kind of doing it with one hand behind your back and what you're actually allowed to do in terms of engaging with some of the consumers. And then also, you may be contacting a whole broad swath of them, and only, a subset are actually with the payer you are eligible with or whatnot. And I feel like, some folks have maybe employer, at least like everyone in the employee population, is potentially eligible for some of this stuff, but still I think is, you make one sale and you are not out of the woods at all. Actually, the hard part then starts.
Yeah, it's so hard. I remember we would try so hard and we would get this like great deal. Like we got, like Anthem in the Midwest, but Anthem has, maybe 15% market share in these states. So it's like, what do? You can't do traditional marketing, because what do you do with the other 85% of the patients, so you're just locked into very specific channels.
And I guess, you alluded to it, obviously, like, these businesses presumably are easier to build now with some of the RPM codes. And I feel like we've seen a wave of startups trying to do similar, things to, or analogous things to what you were doing at Propeller. Like, as you look at the landscape of all these folks trying to do, remote patient monitoring and whatnot, like, how do you think about what will determine who is and isn't successful in this space?
Yeah, I think it's tough. I think it's still a really tough market. You always, again, back to the, like, there's no silver bullet in this space ever. We all, we get excited, like, oh my gosh, there's going to be payment for what we're doing. Like, it's going to unlock everything. And it doesn't, it's still the act of like implementation and getting patients in that's really, really hard. So I worry about that market actually, because how is it going to scale, going hospital, doctor by doctor? Maybe there was a paper that came out, I've forgotten what journal, but it was analyzing RPM claims. And there was some skew in the data or whatever, but it was like a small handful of doctors were writing like all the claims. So it is like not wide. And so I think the ones that'll be successful end up building more and more services on it and look more like a traditional referral partner versus like a service. And so like we have RPM at our core, we just have a full clinic around it. And so I think it makes it easier for companies like that maybe to partner with a primary care doc where it's like a referral for some specialized use case, and then they come back where they might even be just doing their own billing. They probably have an MD so they can establish patient relationship. But I think it's going to be deeper. I think it's going to be like more comprehensive services.
Switching gears to kind of your current days. I mean, obviously you after Propeller, you founded Marley Medical. Maybe just, kind of level set our listeners. What does Marley do? Kind of what's the target patient population, and how do you think about the care model?
Yeah, thanks. So we are a virtual clinic, and we just focus exclusively on complex patients with chronic disease. And we start with cardiometabolic. So as you pointed out, we started out with hypertension. Now we're doing hypertension and weight, some lipid management. We're working on protocols for type 2 diabetes up to some point before, they should probably be at an endo and want to look at that. So it's hypertension, obesity, lipids, and diabetes. What we wanted to do was kind of take some of the learnings from Propeller, which is that if so we did a big look, analysis of what markets and what patients to go into. And we had a couple of criteria. One was presence or availability of data. So we wanted to build a really data-driven model because we saw it work in our hands. And then what that means is that we're collecting data. So we'll send cellular, we won't do Bluetooth. We send cellular devices out to patients. We know how to get good engagement with monitoring. And so then when you have this sort of longitudinal look at a patient, it's very easy to know like who's not doing well and who is doing well. And so you can start to stratify them and give more clinic attention to the ones who need it and who aren't doing well, and less to the ones who do. And so it's a really proactive model. And so for us, the main difference is we just structured it as a fully scoped clinic. So we have an MD-led team. We have NPs, we have pharmacists, health coach, nurse, et cetera, and bring these patients in, and we can monitor them and do med changes, do lifestyle changes. The goal is really to use the data to do this quickly. We want to iterate really quickly. And so you can see if you're getting good monitoring that this patient's not at goal, they're not going to get at goal, let's do something. And by guidelines in hypertension, class 1A guideline, you're supposed to monitor patients regularly, and you're supposed to make a change once a month if they are not at goal. And like, who's going to go to the doctor's office once a month to get their blood pressure measured so that they can get a medication change, obviously. But in this model, you can push it, and do that really, really clearly. And so on the clinician side, it's just proactive.
How did you guys pick your initial markets? I mean, obviously, as a virtual first model, I feel like you kind of had your pick of the litter. What was it about the initial markets that made them a good fit for you?
Yeah, so we looked at markets in two sides. One is like the patient type. And so we did some analyses there and had some criteria. We actually ran some like really fun marketing tests very early, threw some Facebook ads up, threw a landing page up with a bunch of different diseases to see who would click, and like CardioMet from that. And then the real one was sort of, what states do you go into? We had this idea that there was going to be states that were good for us and states that were bad for us, but we didn't know like why. And so brought in a really awesome first employee, and a woman named Sibel from who also worked for us at Propeller, who really led this. And we analyzed all 50 states, and we looked at different, there's regulatory problems, what can doctors do, what can NPs do, what can pharmacists do, compact, who's in the compacts, like to make it easier, rates of disease, and so on. And then the main thing that we ended up focusing on was concentration of payers. So we knew that in our model, we were doing direct acquisition. And so, because we had to control growth, that was like another lesson from Propeller. And so that kind of forces you into being payer agnostic, because you're casting this net and you have to cover all of them. And so we picked states with dense payer coverage. So, big blue states. So you have like, that's why everyone went to North Carolina initially, but we ended up in 6 states in the Midwest where they look like that. Michigan, Illinois have very, dominant blues. And so one, we can get in network, maybe easier, but then when we go and try to contract for better contracts, it's not like 40 or 50 or 60 that I'd have to do in California, but 3 or 4.
Totally, and also when you do well in those markets, like you actually can have a meaningful patient panel, right? For the payers to pay attention to.
Yeah, that was like we'll talk about a bit probably, but that was a big goal of this strategy. Like I think back in the day you could get away with limited data because it was new. Now I think the bar is because companies like Propeller and Omada and Verta and all of the ones who have come before have really raised the bar on like evidence required. And so I think you need like a certain amount of evidence before people start to take you seriously and talk to you.
I mean, I'd love to talk about that evidence. Like, I think one of the challenges, obviously, in these businesses is it takes some time to generate that evidence, right? I mean, there's some things you just can't fast forward, right? Especially on the longitudinal outcomes. But like, how do you think about the timeline and why it takes a certain amount of time to show, both the kind of clinical outcomes that you guys are looking for, as well as like the cost outcomes?
Yeah, well, I think there's another category too, which is it's just operation outcomes. So I think the savvy buyers kind of know that most things fail at implementation. And so if you can prove just your ability to like grow and acquire and onboard and engage patients, that's actually like a big check now. But one of the reasons that we really liked hypertension as a starting is because we can collect really good data, obviously on blood pressure through blood pressure machines in the home, and get that immediately. And we kind of knew that if we could show reductions in blood pressure, there is so much data out there about what that means downstream rather, to like risk, utilization, and cost, that we could start building, a hypothetical model of what we should see in our patient population, and hopefully get people to sort of believe it before we had generated the prospective outcomes and cost data that will be needed. So that was like one of the reasons that we really liked, CardioMet is for data like that. And so our hypothesis there was that if, we could get maybe 500 patients, 1,000 patients, that would be believable. It'd be credible. Like people would believe our engagement, they would believe our retention, they would believe that at least the early clinical outcomes. And then that buys us time to then, we have to invest in evidence for sure and generate harder data, more prospective data, but it got us out of that like cold start where we were stuck until we had that.
I guess one thing I'm curious about is you alluded to this earlier when you were talking about Propeller, that when you were going to payers and talking to them about risk, there was, this, at that point, it was like, hey, we have no idea how to set these things up. We have no idea how to benchmark them, let's just do a PMPM. And it feels like at this point, there's a fair amount of people that are taking on risk. I would say, it's not totally clear, if if there's kind of a consensus on how to benchmark or not. And I'm kind of curious what you found in your experience with Marley, and as you look at the space as a whole, do you feel like we're kind of standardizing on a way to do this, or, in some sense, some people say, well, you can kind of cherry pick or torture the data to say whatever you want. Like, where are we kind of on that spectrum of the kinds of contracts that are being set up?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that we're learning right now. We're having a lot of conversations with payers and risk-taking providers about different structures. And it definitely seems like there is a little bit of normalization with an asterisk. The normalization is that most people are doing some kind of PMPM that covers, the bundle of services with some kind of upside, shared savings, database kicker, something like that. And I think that works. I think where it's not standard or still really confusing to me is the complication of attribution. And so, we just get a lot of, one of the things that was really surprising to me is early conversations with payers. Some of them were like, we've delegated the risk on those patients. And I'm like, you've done what? Like, really? But they believe it, through MA and through ACOs and through other arrangements with providers. And so that was sort of interesting, is like, well, I can't give you total cost because I've already given them total cost, or I've already got them in some relationship. And I think that's where the complexity comes in. So we've gone, talked to those like risk-taking providers who've already been delegated risk, and that's like a simpler conversation for sure. But we're still figuring it out. Like, I do think, everyone talks about carve-outs, specific, domain carve-outs, and kidneys, like the example that everyone uses where it's happened. I'm real curious how that's going to happen in CardioMet or CV or the places we're in. And so we're talking to that. But once you get into that, then it's like much more complicated, because now you're carving out a specific, set of costs. And I don't know, that's where it definitely gets complicated. But I think over time that will become more standard and easier, and hopefully we will figure it out.
Yeah. And how should we think about like the incentives, both on the payer side, like is it just easiest to kind of like delegate all your lives to some primary care provider and let them figure out where to subdelegate them? And then, if you're a risk-bearing primary care entity that got delegated some of these lives, like, maybe do you want to hold on to some, or like, what are like the incentives here about how the allocation problem gets solved?
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, I think one of the things we learned, incentives like rule everything. And so trying to understand this is a super fun problem. Definitely it feels like payers like this, like, hey, we'll just delegate that and take our 15% and we're like good to go, I don't know if that's the way it's going to continue to go. It kind of feels like that right now, though. And then when we talk to the risk-taking providers or ACOs, then it's really interesting because, they're managing, they have a lot of partners who are these primary care docs, and they're delegated the risk. So what we're finding, though, is that some of those primary care providers definitely have patients in their panel that they know they're not doing well with. They can't engage them. They're really tough. And so they're like, the incentive is, well, if you give me those patients through a referral or give me a list of them and we'll market to them, everyone should do better, right? Because if we do better and keep them out of the hospital, then there's more savings to be had, and that'll get split with the primary and us and whatever. So I do think there's something there where the incentives actually line up for all the parties. The other that we've heard is really interesting is that, attribution is based on claims to the ACO or to anyone, to, Oak or anyone. But there's a group of those that aren't engaged, they're attributed to the risk-taking entity, but there's like no management happening. And so there might be an opportunity for companies like us and others to go in and like focus on those tough ones, and try to get some management going, because right now they're just going to cost them money. And so I'm pretty optimistic from the incentive side that there's something there that makes sense.
And I'm curious, like, obviously a lot of folks are trying to build care models for, chronic, patients with chronic conditions. How do you think about like, when a payer is thinking about who to work with, or when Oak Street or some of these folks, like, how do you think about kind of like standing out through the noise and like, maybe you're the 10th person that they've met that week that's like, oh yeah, give us the X patients of your panel. Like, what do you think ultimately? It does feel like there's a lot of like noise in the market right now, and I assume eventually it settles, but I'm wondering, along what lines it settles and how you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. We'll find out, but I totally agree with you. So I get that question a lot. Like, who do you, what about your competition? And early on, it was like, all we care about is acquiring patients. And honestly, there's like no competition. Like, there isn't a patient out there that, knows us and Miga or us and Galileo, or in choosing between them. And so that's not really where it happens. But definitely now that we're starting to spin into the B2B side, that's where the competition is. And so I think there, our strategy was to just focus down, acquire a bunch of patients. And so I think that's where we differentiate is I can go in there, hopefully, I mean, we'll see, right? I go in there and have like operational sort of excellence points, like we've been beaten up doing this before. So we focused a lot on the things where we know it goes wrong, which is acquisition, onboarding, engagement, et cetera. And so we can actually execute this program for you. And we already have these like real clear indicators of clinical success with blood pressure, weight, lipids, things like that. And so I think it is still that like data pitch. You have to build like the credibility, that they believe that they will be successful. I do think there's like a lot of skepticism out there because frankly, over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of awesome programs that didn't work, and didn't execute, and they should have. And so that's where I lean in. It's just like, we'll, actually get this executed because that's what we focus on.
We wouldn't be a venture capital hosted podcast if we didn't shamelessly at least ask you a little bit about AI and all the craze that's happening. I mean, obviously, I think both I'd be super curious both within the Marley context, but then also you have like just a tremendous breadth of knowledge in this industry. So as you think about like all this generative AI hype, like one, I'm curious, like, is it something you guys are thinking about or incorporating at all at Marley? And like, what's your take on all the hype?
I mean, we're definitely thinking about it a lot. I think my team is sick of hearing me talk about it. And so I think the interesting one, when I started, 15 years ago or something, I was like the prototypical tech optimist. It was, everything was going to be great. We were going to solve all these things. I think I went through a phase where I became like a complete skeptic. I'm like, oh man, no, it's just service. It's service design, and maybe the tech can help a little bit. And now I've gotten back up to like, tech can be really efficient. This is the first time in like many years where I'm like crazy excited, and thinking that it's like real. And we'll see. But I'm like, this is real. Like there are real use cases. There are real things going on. We've definitely played around with it, and we will invest in this going forward. I think its efficiency, we have this clinic. It's predominantly messaging, right? And very data driven. And these are like incredibly good use cases. Like we spend so much time messaging. The most obvious use case for us is have this thing write a first draft response that then the care team can review, edit, and then send. It saves a bunch of time. We played around with some like very low stakes stuff that was really fun. Like we did, a branding exercise like everyone does, and you have the Marley tone and voice and all this stuff. But I uploaded those documents about what it was and then samples and taught it the Marley marketing voice. And this thing writes emails for us. It's doing like, we're writing drip campaigns, and these are all ChatGPT, and they're amazing. So that's like low stakes. We also played around with one idea that I'm really fond of, which was around personalization. So we do a lot of, we have what we call a health style program, which is our behavior change. And, we send out challenges and all of these things, but we did an experiment where we just wrote like a little persona on the patient. It's like unmotivated, has been failing, the last 3 weeks, or heavily motivated, and had it tailor the message with the goal to that patient. And it was kind of amazing.
That's fascinating. The idea that like, rather than generating some generic note from a coach, you actually teach the model some context on who that person is.
And you could teach it your coaching voice for sure. I mean, one of them, it was like a step challenge, and no joke, this thing wrote like, it was for a demotivated patient who hadn't, achieved the goals. Don't worry, we're in it together. We're with you step by step. And I'm like, really? That was amazing. And so, yeah, I think there's like a great opportunity. I mean, then the most obvious ones, people are using it for like charting, they're, a bridge, and these guys are absolutely amazing at writing very good chart notes with very good structured data. We're looking at it for patient summaries of the visit. Yeah, I think there's like a lot of very real use cases. And because, the big challenge with managing chronic disease patients is this mismatch, between primary and specialty. We have like underutilized, very episodic, short versus overutilized, expensive specialty. And so you need a different model. And that's our pitch, is like, we fill this middle layer, and it has to be a higher touch model, like for these patients, and higher touch is expensive. And so we talk about efficiency a lot. And so if you think about AI as an efficiency driver, all of a sudden it sort of unlocks these higher touch, more engaging models, with really, you can make really good margins on them if you can be efficient. But that's like the only way, in my experience, to actually effectively manage these really challenging patients with, multiple chronic diseases.
Super interesting. And how do you think about like you were kind of mentioning obviously the kind of middle layer between primary care and specialty. How do you think about like the linking with kind of the in-person component of this, or like a level of acuity at which point you're like, okay, like this person should be seen in person, or we should refer out, like both today and then ultimately I'm curious, like, 5-10 years down the line, what the Marley model might look like there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super important to connect back in, obviously. Like one of the things we spend a lot of time on is how do we fit into a patient's continuum of care? You can't be this thing off to the side. And so today we've already referred people for in-person for sure. Sometimes it's back to a PCP that they have that's in person. We send people to the ED, of course, to different kind of testing or whatever. I think one of the big opportunities for these virtual programs and services that we have, like ours is higher touch. It's definitely more engaging. So we have like a rudder, like people will go, I think, where they trust us. They'll go where we recommend them. And so it creates this opportunity to create this really high performance referral network. And so we're starting to look at that, and I think, you go 5 years down the road, I think it's going to be really cool partnerships with like hospital systems in the region, because we're valuable too. Like we have valuable patients that need imaging and they need stents and they need all sorts of stuff. And so I think I think you almost create like a virtual CIN, like clinically integrated network where, we're the hub. And then we've partnered with all these other groups to send people out, not just in person. Like I've been talking to other virtuals, like Concert Health for mental health, like could we bring that in? And we were talking to Amplify MD, which is, specialists, that could embed into your team. And so I'm very interested in how do you connect dots? And again, it's reduce friction, make it a really seamless experience for the patient, because then they'll actually do it. We know what to do, right? It's just, we make it so hard that people can't stay on plan. And so by connecting all of these things, I think it makes it easier.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Like once you build that trust relationship with the patient and you're kind of their primary engagement point with the health system, kind of becoming their care navigator, figuring out the right way for them to interact with other parts of the system. It makes a tremendous amount of sense. Chris, we always like to kind of end our interviews with a quick fire round where we ask some kind of hot take questions to get your opinions. And I'm very excited about this. I feel like you'll have some good opinions on this stuff. The first thing we always ask is, I feel like you and I are always on the same conference circuit. I see you at the same themes being discussed, year in and year out. And so I'm curious, what's one thing you'd say in digital health that's overhyped right now and one that's underhyped?
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked a little bit about this. I think that overhyped is like employers and as a go-to-market strategy and B2B2C. I think that people are just looking at it that there's been success. And so everyone's kind of tucking into that. And I think it's going to be a slaughter, honestly. It's just not great. B2B2C is not what it's cracked up to be.
That's both just because of the engagement problems and also because of just how crowded it's getting there.
Well, I think now it's doubly before. Now I think it's really hard to get these contracts because these people are getting bombarded by, I think the products are correct, right? You have all these niche products, and I say niche is a good word, because it means it's focused and tailored and solves a problem. But that is really hard in the B2B kind of realm. And so I think that I wish I would hear more people talk about different models that they're trying to use to go to market and not try to tuck into that one. And we also talked about, I think, underhyped or relatively well hyped. I think AI, man, I actually think that this is real this time. It's not hype. The other one I'd probably add in are GLP-1s. I think that these are absolute miracle drugs, and people have to figure out how to use them and pay for them and all that.
How do they fit into your care model today?
Yeah, I mean, we have a majority obese population, and so I think that they're amazing. We've started to prescribe them. We are the most on-label people ever. All of our patients have CV risk and have BMIs over 30 and so on. And we're seeing ridiculous results even, really early on. We've taken people off of hypertension medications or de-escalated them, which is one of the number one requests we get. Because you get these polychronic patients, they're on so many meds. They're like, can you just take some off? And this is the way. I think we have a ton to figure out, but I think it's going to be super fascinating. There's early results of the SELECT trial came out, which was a high-risk CV trial with a 20% reduction in major cardiac events. And so it becomes almost unethical. It becomes unethical to not use these drugs in that population once that study is published. You know, so we have to figure it out. Like you can't. It'd be like telling a person with heart failure that they can't get an ACE inhibitor where there's like proof that it saves lives. You know, and so I think we have a really interesting conundrum coming up.
Totally. No, the clinical outcomes are just insane. And so effective. I do wonder, as like, you know, an entity that wants to take risk at some point, I mean, imagine they probably do increase cost for you guys, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think this is one of the places where, you know, healthcare system's weird. Drug spend is different than medical spend. And so it's not always clear where things are or are not. I think, you know, that's why employers are like totally freaking out about it because they pay both drug spend and medical spend. But yeah, for sure, you have to believe that the ROI is there, that these people are going to do so much better that over a long period of time, they're going to cost a lot less. So I think in the Medicare market, it's really interesting where obviously you have the same payer for a really long time and the same contract. I think in commercial, it's much trickier.
And then I guess, you know, if we gave you a powerful magic wand to make one policy change that would make healthcare better in the U.S., what would you do?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's a long list. I think where I am now, it would be some form of single payer. And the reason is because I think so much of the big problems are around contracting and pricing. Like now that we're deep into like contracting and pricing with like multiple payers and multiple states and different things, man, no wonder why we have like, what is it, like 8-to-1 admins to like clinical professionals. And I think that's what leads to the complexity in healthcare. So if there was some like Medicare plus Medicare Advantage where everyone had it, but you just know, man, these are the prices for this region and, you know, do it or not. It would be so much easier for innovators. Like it would just make everything simpler. And not saying, you know, I think then you would have providers actually able to compete more, you know, on experience and outcomes, because I'm not just sitting around with my 4x Medicare prices because I'm the only hospital in town and I can charge whatever I want type of thing.
No, but that makes a bunch of sense. You know, obviously you were, you know, around in the early days of the kind of first wave of digital health companies. I'm curious if there's something that was tried back then, 2010, 2011, that like didn't work at that time, but you're like, oh man, that like actually might work now.
Oh, great question. Yeah, I think, you know, back then, one of the things that we thought was going to happen really, really fast was sort of this concept of consumer-driven healthcare. And I think that it just took so long, but now you're starting to really see, you know, signs of life in consumer-directed healthcare. I think you still obviously have this like crazy third-party payer problem. But, you know, we're trying to figure that out, go to the patients first and then get payers to pay and then do whatever. And then obviously all of the direct to consumer companies that actually are successful now. So I think that's one. I'm a big believer, like there's no idea from those times that was bad actually, right? Yeah. I just think that the time wasn't right or the configuration wasn't right. There was definitely like the group was seeing the future back then. It just, we didn't, you know, the timeline is impossible to predict.
And then what's like a favorite company in digital health, like outside of kind of Marley's world?
Oh man. Well, I'm biased towards some of the old ones. You know, I still love some of the OGs. I love Omada. You know, it's just to watch them like make it through everything. I've always said that they were like my favorite company after, you know, Propeller and now Marley. But just to watch, you know, and I love Sean and like watch them from like the very beginning, like how did they survive and like pull this off to the point where they have almost like universal or broad coverage, you know, because they have so many contracts and so on. Yeah, there's a lot. I love, you know, all of the new kind of virtual care companies that are focused on specific populations. I love things like Folks and Spora and just where there's been these crazy unmet needs in populations. And now all of a sudden we have a vehicle, like we try to put ourselves in that realm. Like the stories we hear about shame people feel if you're obese and like going to the doctor, you know, and you have all these virtual obesity clinics now, like Accomplish and some others where it's, you know, I don't know, it's just super focused on solving a need that wasn't there before. So that category of really specific use cases for specific populations, I just love.
Do you think that's the future of healthcare? Like these very more specific, like, niche in a good way, as you said, kind of targeted care models. I mean, obviously, I feel like all these industries go through, we call it bundling and unbundling, right? Where it's it's got as specific as possible, and then it's like, well, actually, this person who's in these 4 niche models might be better taken care of over one overarching one. Like, where do you think we end up?
I don't know. I was going to say, we're definitely in like an unbundling phase, and then we'll go back bundling. I think. If I had to guess, I think what happens is, whoever has the best relationship wins in the rebundling. And so if one of those companies ends up with like, man, I just trust this doc, this company, then it makes sense for that company to consolidate more services and become more of their like broad primary care, broad navigator, whatever. But you need that like specificity to win, to build that like super tight relationship. So I think, that would be it. And then it's sort of how it gets rebundled. But maybe some of those float to the top and become the dominant for that population. And then everyone else has to be, all the other services have to be underneath them. I think that's a possibility.
Yeah, it all kind of flows from the trusted patient relationship, and I feel like that's a great no, just given what you're doing at Marley, right? I mean, I think that's exactly what it seems like you guys are able to do, and I think once you do that, it's not hard to imagine all the cool things you can do on top of it. Chris, this has been like a fascinating conversation, super wide ranging. You're like a renaissance man of healthcare. I guess like I'm sure folks will want to pull on all sorts of threads, learn more about you, learn more about Marley. What's the best way for them to do that?
We have, marleymedical.com. You can check out the company. As you know, I spend too much time on Twitter. I'm trying to work on that, but you can get me on Twitter for sure. And then people often, I'm in the Health Tech Nerds Slack group, which is another good venue. And if you happen to be in the Bay Area, give me a ping because I'm around here and go to events and stuff.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thanks so much for coming on. This was a super interesting conversation.
Yeah, that was really fun. Thanks so much, Jacob. I really appreciate it.